Well, good afternoon, viewers. Today we have a 2011 F150 with a 3.7 V6. And it's here because every once in a while the starter grinds. It's had a couple of starters put in it, and I've taken the flywheel out. Let me zoom in on the flywheel teeth. And I rotated the engine, and that's the first spot that I see, and that one's enough to cause a problem. The engine tends to stop in one of three positions because it's a V6. So if it stops in that spot, and that's almost where it was when I took the starter out, you can see my white paint mark. I didn't turn it very far. So now we have to pull the transmission back to get the flywheel out. I'm going to attempt to do this without completely disassembling this thing. Got to disconnect the cooler lines because they're rigid. Undo the bell housing, obviously, the torque converter. Remove the rear drive shaft. Better take it off. Let's see, we're going to do the front drive shaft. I'm hoping to leave the exhaust intact. The front drive shaft, yes, we'll have to undo the front drive shaft too. This is rusty. Very rusty. Look at those exhaust manifold bolts. At least they're hexagonal still. Oh well. Let's get started. So there's a little access hole with a plastic cover above the starter. A couple plastic push pins, pull it out. Then you can access the 4 torque converter nuts. They're 50mm nuts. Crankshaft bolt is 18mm, turn it clockwise only. So I've got the 4 bolts or 4 nuts off the flywheel. Don't drop any, especially when you're putting it back together. If you drop a flywheel bolt, torque converter bolt down in here, you're gonna have a bad day. There's one 10mm bolt there. Of course, the starter bolts. Only good thing about not having a dipstick is we don't have to deal with the dipstick tube. I got the drive shaft off. Make sure you clean this flange before you reinstall it. I've marked it, although it shouldn't technically matter, but it's always good practice. I've got the 6 bolts out of the front flange, and I'm going to use an air chisel to try to break this free. So I got the transmission jack set up about 5 inches from the crossover pipe, hoping I can pull the transmission back to here, leaving the crossover attached. It should slide off of this mount. I might unbolt this mount because it's easy. It's right here. 4 torque converter bolts or bell housing bolts on this side, 13mm heads. One way up there. You can get with a 4-foot extension from back here. I hope there's no more on top of the bell housing. I don't think so. I can't see up there. Disconnect that wiring harness clip, the push pin up here. Right up there. There's one at the front and one at the back. I believe I'm going to be able to leave the harness. And I got this ratchet strap down to the transmission jack, so because it's back heavy with the torque transfer case on the back here. There is a couple of fuel lines and a blue bracket up there. I'm going to have to release that bracket. Make sure when you put your ratchet strap over top of the tranny that you don't go over top of any of the lines or the wiring harness. You see one bolt up there. I don't see any more bell housing bolts. There's one at the bottom and one facing forward below the starter, behind the starter. So I took that exhaust bracket off and the transfer case and rear mount, but there is one more bolt, at least one more bolt up there on top of the bell housing. You can barely see it. There might even be 2. Wow. hoping to get it from the back here. Maybe if I lower the transmission down a bit. Might be able to reach up from back here with the extension. So there's another bolt up there below the vent hose. I got a bore scope up there so I can see it, because I can't see it from down here. I'm going to try to get a long extension on it from down here with a 13 mil flex. Well, there's the transmission slid back about 3 inches. It might go back a little bit more, but I got enough room to get in there. There's another bell housing bolt from the front matching this one. So if you put this bottom bolt in here, you can use a screwdriver against the teeth of the flywheel to keep it from rotating. There's 8 17 millimeter headed bolts, a long ratchet, good quality shallow socket. And then I marked the flywheel teeth with white paint, because I'm not sure if this goes on in one way only, but at least I'll know. You can see this worn spot on the flywheel here. And we got to get the flywheel out. So I was right, the bolts are offset. This will only go on in one way, so that's why I marked the original one at 6 o'clock. You turn it 90 degrees, the bolts don't line, the crankshaft mounting bolts are offset. So at least now I can put it back in the same orientation as I took it out. And yes, we're putting a used one because the new one is 2 to 3 weeks away. So I got the flywheel in, and I'm doing up the last torque converter bolt or nut. I've got a magnetic insert in my 15 mil socket so that I don't drop the nut, because if you drop the nut, you're going to take the transmission back out. So that's holding it in place. I put a little blue Loctite on it too. So there's the final hard to get at bolt. I took this heat shield off, one bolt on the frame. It was cut off at the front anyways. So we can put the wiring harness back in. Fuel lines back in, and the transmission mount back in right now. So as I mentioned before, when I was taking this apart, make sure you clean the flanges on the drive shaft and the pinion yoke, otherwise it might be out of true. We just have to check the fluid levels, which shouldn't be low because we didn't lose anything. Maybe a couple ounces out of the cooler lines. Starters reinstalled, all the bell housing bolts, harnesses were secured. That was fun. Let's hook up the battery. So he's got a mode door actuator, blend door actuator problem. You can hear it clicking. Now that I reconnected the battery, it's going through a relearn. But that's secondary. Well, I talked to him about the heater controls, reset the radio stations, and the clock. Take it for a road test to make sure there's no leaks.